Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, April 20th. There are different elements to what we're doing tonight, but we're in the aftermath of the conference that was held by the Schiller Institute and keynoted by Helga Sepp-LaRouche of a two-day conference which just concluded this past Sunday. Various actions were proposed at the conference of an international nature. We'll probably have a chance to talk about those a little bit more later. Importantly, what we have been doing is trying to make a point, which is a rather important one, which is that there has to be a difference between what is referred to as a unipolar world and what many are referring to as a multipolar world, that there is something higher than either unipolarity or multipolarity. Now, in our two-day conference called Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace for the Planet, at the end of the third panel of that conference, Dennis Small, who had given the keynote, said the following. He said, "I would like to leave you with a provocative thought. Lyndon LaRouche often said that when you are given a choice between two alternatives, choose the third. The idea of the unipolar world is equivalent to that of Hobbes. That is to say, that man is a beast. He cannot be trusted to do anything other than to kill his neighbor. It's a war of one against all, and we need a Leviathan. We need a unipolar world. We need somebody to run the show." And just to add to that, that's the notion of the park ranger for the human race, for the human zoo, which is the kind of thing which is the underlying philosophical assumption of what is often referred to as green policy or the climate change policy, that someone must be a park ranger for the whole human race and is going to propose in the name of the religion called global warming to regulate how many people should live on the planet and how they should live. Dennis went on to say the opposition to that idea of a unipolar world, of a multipolar world, is the idea of the Enlightenment, the idea of Rousseau, of a social contract. Now, it's premised on the same idea that man is essentially a beast and only knows what his senses inform him about. But you can establish peace by some sort of a social contract among the various parties. Each group is allowed its own area of influence, and you leave it at that, a social contract. And he talked about this. He talked about the sophist Voltaire and said, this is Voltaire's idea of everybody being allowed to cultivate their own garden. Some of you know that in Canada, they used to talk about the difference between a melting pot, as in the United States, and a mosaic, as in Canada, where the idea is that everyone is contributing to this picture, but they're all little pieces, and you put your little piece in, and that's not the same as a melting pot where things get crushed at the bottom, and, these various sorts of things that have been said. But the idea that Dennis put forward is that there is something different than either a unipolar or a multipolar world. And this was an idea that came from Leibniz. And Leibniz, in turn, had perfected this idea, which had been first stated by Nicholas of Cusa. And that's the idea that there's one humanity, and that is primary. There are multiple nations that are sovereign, and they all form part of that one humanity. So what you are trying to do is you're trying to allow the individual the greatest possible freedom to act on behalf of that one humanity with the limited talent of life that he or she has been bequeathed. And that when you talk about economics, or you talk about politics, or you talk about any other secular form of social expression of the human race, purpose is, or has to be, that the individual spark of creativity, the divine spark in each person, and of course this is different in the sense that there are different capacities that each and every person has. But the point of the thing is to allow the greatest possible transparency between the individual and that entire humanity, with that humanity acting on behalf of the principle of life in the universe. That life in the universe has an extraterrestrial imperative, that it has an imperative to grow, to develop, and to extend itself. And that the human species, blessed with self-consciousness, is the vehicle by which life is to be propagated through the universe as a whole, and certainly those portions of the universe that we populate. I mean, otherwise, you wouldn't have cognition, wouldn't exist unless it had a purpose. The fact that there are those that doubt the idea of purpose is irrelevant to the fact that they would otherwise have to explain how it arose in a universe without God if it were not a natural phenomenon. That is to say, if you're an atheist, and you say, well, there's no God, there's no principle like that, but you can't deny the existence of the mind, your mind, that has contemplated that and which therefore has an actual purpose. It has a purpose because otherwise there'd be nothing driving the thought in the first place. So the point here is that life of all forms, and for that matter, even interesting intersection points between life and non-life. These are all characterized by productive processes, economic processes as we call it. In our case, the idea of physical economy, which is that which is to be distinguished from monetary systems and the notion of money as a driving force for an economy. Now, in the last 24, 48 hours, something has developed that we want to call everybody's attention to because it's critical in terms of implementing some of the ideas that got put forward at this conference, especially that idea of a community of principle, a sovereign community of principle, in which the one human species is allowed to propagate itself at the highest levels of standards of living for the greatest possible expression of individual creativity, as that can be concretized in societies that achieve with less muscle effort the greatest possible extent of the nations and populations that comprise them. So in the last 48 hours, a congresswoman, Marcy Kaptur, with whom we've worked over many years, off and on, has introduced House Resolution 2714, and it is titled the Return to Prudent Banking Act of 2023. Now, this is an act that calls for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. And what we've done is we've written a press release, which will also appear in the form of a leaflet, to try to give people some background on this and why it's so important. It's not only that we've called for this for a long time, but it's also because this is a breaking development which allows the United States to directly enter into a completely different form of negotiation with China, Russia, for that matter, Western Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa. So I'm just going to read part of what we've written about this. The principal sponsor of the Prudent Banking Bill, Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, described her legislation in a statement yesterday as a measure which will, quote, reinstate essential provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act, or the Banking Act of 1933, which had provided an unprecedented half-century of economic stability. It will restore the separation of commercial and investment banking. This is all a quote from her that I'm reading. Wall Street has proven that it cannot control itself, and it is only a matter of time before it steers America into the next financial crisis. It cannot be any clearer that the time for systemic reform is now, which is why I am introducing the Return to Prudent Banking Act to do just that. And so there's various things that we then describe about all of this, but there's a critical importance in a paragraph of the leaflet statement that we've written, and it's this: the 1999 repeal of Glass-Steagall in the United States marked the advent of all kinds of deregulated financial practices, speculation, and debt bubbles, leading inevitably to the 2007 to 2009 crisis. When Glass-Steagall was not restored at that time, the bailouts and liquidity pumping that followed created an everything bubble, which is now bursting. The recent bank failures from California to Switzerland are just the beginning of the crisis. Now, for those who were not around 16 years ago, when Lyndon LaRouche spoke about this, particularly in July of 2007, where he described in great detail that there was no possible way to save the system, and that the crisis was one that could be addressed at that time with measures that he proposed. Were it not addressed at that time, you would go into a period of radical instability leading to forms of warfare and breakdowns, physical breakdowns of society, in which diseases, pandemics, and so on would begin to erupt and to occur, not merely because they might be manipulated out of laboratories, but because you have a physical degradation of the living standards and conditions of once industrialized advanced states. And under those circumstances, you don't just simply go backwards. What you do is you accelerate into a kind of a devolution. It's not a return to an earlier state. It's a devolution to a state far worse than anything in the past. And this has clearly erupted and is the thing for us to be concerned about. So what we want to just say about this is that the drive toward war that we are seeing, and that drive that's seen in the case of the Ukraine war, has to be really understood from the standpoint that what is provoking that, what is powering that, what is driving that, is this process of failure to have reimposed Glass-Steagall back in 2007. That would have meant that, yes, there would have been 8 years where that had not been enforced, and yes, it would have meant a massive dry out of the political system and so on, the financial system, but it wasn't done. It wasn't done, and instead we got the Barack Obama regime, and we got the attempts, we had a Trump regime in which there was an attempt to correct aspects of this. But they weren't informed economically. There was an attempt that would have corrected part of it because of the attack on the Paris Accords. Because what we keep calling global warming, or what gets called climate change, is not that at all. It is a drive for deindustrialization of the type we see, unfortunately, most clearly manifested in Germany, where they just closed down their final 3 nuclear power plants. They once had 17. They have euthanized 11 of them. I'm not sure whether they euthanized 12, 13, and 14, but 15, 16, and 17 were closed on April 15th. Now, this is a nation which is also calling for its population to all go to electric cars, but now has less electricity of a capability to generate, that it can generate, than it had before, and doesn't even have enough gas to be able to get through anything other than perhaps a full mild winter of 2023 to 2024, and could easily be in a state of crisis otherwise. It's also a nation that has reversed itself in its military posture toward Russia, and has, to the great horror, actually, of German military personnel who are very aware of what it all means. They've now returned to German tanks, going into an area, in this case Ukraine, and re-invoking the images and the specter of what went on in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. These are extraordinarily dangerous things to have happen. What we want to do tonight is to discuss how this measure, for one, among other measures, can be the basis for the United States to be brought into this alliance that's now begun to clearly manifest itself in certain actions taken in particular over the last 10, 12 days involving the nation of Brazil, and that its President Lula traveling to China, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov being in various countries in South America, including Venezuela, Cuba, and also Brazil, and various peace efforts that have been already underway in Southwest Asia and which are being extended to Africa, not entirely smoothly. We have the conflict in Sudan, which reflects another kind of a pushback by Anglo-American intelligence against some of the actions that the Chinese, Russians, and various of the actors in Southwest Asia like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even UAE as well, they're trying to get involved in tamping down that crisis in Sudan. But what we want to do is, just before we have our speaker, who I don't think is with us yet, quite, let's say a couple of other things about items that people have heard in the news and have to, in this case, be addressed. Some of you are aware that there has been a censorship of Seymour Hersh by Facebook. If you didn't know what has happened is that the original Seymour Hersh story of February 8th called How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline is now being censored by Facebook. And the way this works is if you search for the article on Facebook, it will now redirect readers to a Norwegian language website, a fact checker, which I think is called Fact 6 or something like that. I have the name here in a moment. So you can't, but it's in Norwegian. You can't read it. You can find a translation if you're interested. But the main point is that the Seymour Hersh piece is not available. What happens is you get a warning that says, before you share this content, you might want to know that there is additional reporting from a Norwegian fact-checking source, Factisk, F-A-C-T-I-S-K. And then they say, if you get a big black square that comes up, it says false information checked by independent fact checkers. And then there's also a warning that some people have seen, this is now a later development, which says that pages that repeatedly publish or share false news will see their overall distribution reduced and be restricted in other ways. What happened is that the journalist Michael Schellenberger talked about this, and he noticed that his sites were being restricted. So that's obviously extremely important. The Norwegian fact-checking site that they refer to is funded by a Norwegian state-owned media company, and that company is, of course, attached to the Norwegian government. Now, remember that Seymour Hersh asserted that Norway assisted the United States in the blowing up of the pipeline. What Biden did was that he used the United States Navy with the assistance of Norway to carry out the operation. It should also be, then the Norwegian broadcaster's name is NRK, by the way. That's just the name, so you just know who it is. So what you have here is that the Norwegian government is acting to suppress a story which was written by an American saying that the Norwegian government assisted the United States in blowing up the pipeline. Also, it should be noted that Facebook's head of security comes from the Atlantic Council, that's NATO's mouthpiece, and the head of misinformation for Facebook is a former CIA officer. So that's one story you want to know that has happened. The other story, which we will probably get a chance to talk about a lot more later, and I don't want to try to go through this in great detail, involves a Department of Justice indictment against 5 members of this group called the Uhuru Group. It's an African-American black nationalist organization in Florida, and the Department of Justice press release says it's called U.S. citizens and Russian intelligence officers charged with conspiring to use U.S. citizens as illegal agents of the Russian government. Defendants sought to sow discord, spread pro-Russia propaganda, and interfere in elections in the United States. Now, again, we'll talk about this a bit more later in questions if people have questions about it. I'd just like to point out having direct familiarity with these sorts of organizations because I was involved in one many years ago. But again, the organization they're talking about goes back to that exact period. What these people were doing is no different than what the average radical black nationalist organization stated or advocated back in 1970, 71, 72, 50 years ago. And clearly what is really intended here is to walk the United States step by step toward a full suppression of any freedom of thought and expression. And it's important to know that part of the impulse for all of this comes out of what's called the White House Summit for Democracy Summit. At least Facebook is blaming that gathering, which they attended, for their recent behavior. What they began doing is censoring what they called false narratives on their site, and they state that they agreed to do this if it would weaken the support, if it would help to stop the weakening of support for Ukraine in the United States. So these are sort of breaking stories and evolving stories that one just has to know about. They affect the general environment clearly in the United States. But coming back to what we opened with on Glass-Steagall, and coming back to what we can do, we're now in a situation where if the American people step in with the leadership of the LaRouche organization, and we call not just for the reinstatement of the American Glass-Steagall, no, a global Glass-Steagall. Clearly we saw from the Silicon Valley Bank blowout, and then the immediately subsequent Credit Suisse blowout, and where we then learned that they and other banks had been contaminated by what was going on at the Silicon Valley Bank. Clearly, there has to be a coordination internationally to dry out the hundreds of trillions to quadrillions of dollars worth of exposure in the system. And so you can't just do it in one country. You've got to do this globally. The BRICS nations would clearly favor that. Russia and China are not going to have any problem with that. But more importantly, there's a necessity to doing it if we are going to keep local banks functioning, if we're going to deliver unemployment or a compensation or Social Security, if we're going to be able to keep the American people alive, then in fact, these actions will in fact have to be taken. There's no longer anything else to loot inside of the United States. And therefore, the impulse to war that we keep hearing coming from, whether it's the Biden administration or people around the Biden administration, is one that we can, in fact, rein in only by stopping the wars and imposing sort of instating for the first time a global Glass-Steagall. let me just check and see if Diane has joined us.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, you are there. Very good. Fine. Just wanted to make sure that we got you there. So this is Diane Sare, independent candidate for United States Senate. And Diane, I'd like to ask you first, before whatever else you have to say, if you have any comment about this development that happened basically in the last 24 hours, Marcy Kaptur, and what she has put forward here.
Well, I think this is crucial. And, you know, history is an interesting thing, or the way that events develop, because 10, 12 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche and many of us were in a huge fight. In fact, there were probably people on this call who went to Congress again and again and again to try and get Glass-Steagall reinstated. We even at one point had 84 co-sponsors. And Lyndon LaRouche was very angry that he felt that we didn't fully understand the urgency of it, that it wasn't just a law, that it was a principle. And what became very clear is the members of Congress we were working with certainly didn't understand it as that, even though we knew that various people in London had literally said if Glass-Steagall were to be reinstated, they would consider it a casus belli, that is, a cause for war. Because to separate the banks according to function means that someone has to actually go through what is in the bank and find out how it got there and what it's connected to and whether it's legitimate or not. And in many cases, in most of our banks now, because it's so few and they're so large, you would find massive amounts of drug money laundering, money from human trafficking, gun running, you name it. So you can imagine for people associated with the royal family and others, this would be quite problematic. I can also say that Whitney Webb has just written an article called, or it's going to be a series, I guess, about the rise of Jamie Dimon. She published an entire book on the Jeffrey Epstein situation. And what you see is this whole operation that he was involved in with his trafficking of minors, or whatever you want to call it, his sex rings and so on, was completely intimately entangled with getting certain financial policies through. And in fact, it was none other than Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, who signed off on having Jeffrey Epstein have his first ever meeting with Bill Clinton in 1993. And Jeff Epstein, Sandy Weil, Jamie Dimon were all, and Robert Rubin were all intimately involved in getting the Glass-Steagall Act repealed so that various people, including Jamie Dimon, could make a lot of money. Travelers and Citibank, which occurred before Glass-Steagall was repealed, but then to follow through on that, they had to get rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. So the point of this is it's not just a law. It is a principle. It changes the way the banks function. And it only has popped up again because we have these bank failures in the last few weeks, the Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, Silvergate Bank, Credit Suisse. But I'm sure most of the people on this call have a sense that just because they got $700 billion of bailouts and we're told everything is fine, that probably you can be pretty sure that there is something systemic going on, everything is not fine, and that every major financial institution is in the same situation or worse, and we're just waiting for that bomb to detonate. So this is really important, and we should get to our congressman about it, and we should get the thing through, which would be a revolution. And I think it would be very worth noting who opposes it, because as in the case of people who attack LaRouche, people who oppose the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall probably have something to hide or are coming under intense pressure from someone who has something to hide. That's it.
Now, you also have, you're sort of involved in a few things which you might want to tell us a little bit about. You spoke at the conference. Now, actually, because I know that there are some people on tonight that were not at the conference, and I wondered if you might just say something about your own impressions of what happened at that conference and what you were trying to get across there.
Well, it's clear that at least 75%, if not more, of the world's population has gotten off the sinking, stinking, bankrupt Titanic of the transatlantic Anglo-Dutch financial system. And there is a sort of a mirror of that in terms of what's happening in the United States with this disintegration of the party system, the party divisions, and people coming together on matters that are really important, like war and peace, the economy, etc. We saw that at the Rage Against the War Machine. The thing that concerns me, what I addressed at the conference, was that in the United States, you have people who, partly it's a reaction, an abreaction to having been bludgeoned into being so divided from each other, that everyone wants to just sort of hold hands and say we're all together, and that doesn't work either. You really have to have a mission. And you can think of the way a boat or something organizes water. When, if you think of the bow of the boat, when it's moving forward, there is a wave formation that is very organized. If you have water that's just sitting there with nothing, it is not organized, and in fact it can become, as I went through in the conference, the home of many undesirable, unsanitary kinds of slimy things, including diseases. And my concern is that people have, Dennis brought up the Paris Climate Accords, the environmentalist movement. This is a real problem. Take Code Pink, for example. Medea Benjamin is clearly a courageous woman. She's done many, many interventions against war. She's been arrested for that many times. But she also, one of her big polemics against war is that it's not green. Well, that's for sure. If you have a thermonuclear explosion, you're going to have carbon and soot everywhere, and cloud formation up above the ionosphere where it can't get rained out. And, so, okay, that's true. Having a nuclear war or any war is very bad for the environment. But that's why are we saying that, and what is she proposing? The best thing for the environment is the maximum development of man with the maximum energy flux density, which means nuclear power, developing fusion, going to Mars, controlling water, man having more power over nature. And if you don't understand that, you will be defeating your own purpose, because you won't actually know how to get mankind out of this. So that's some of what I took up. I was very pleased with the conference. We had people on from so many different nations, and I think did we have anyone from Australia? We had nearly every continent represented there. And I think it shows the power of this movement and the hunger for ideas. I think the jury is still out on whether we can win to get the planet to move fully in the right direction, and that depends very much on us here in the United States.
Let me also make a comment here, which I noticed and I didn't actually say earlier, that the statement from Representative Kaptur says that, quote, the legislation has been endorsed by the Schiller Institute and the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. So that in the actual press release that was put out about this, the Schiller Institute is specifically referenced as an endorsing organization, obviously that's a bit of a change. What's your view of the relationship between, because the Schiller Institute is an international organization, and then there's a whole panel, which is the third day, which was discussing the way in which this whole process of what was happening with the BRICS organization, the idea of trade without currency was brought up by Dennis Small. The idea about a shift of a de-dollarization, that is to say, out of the zombie dollar, which has unfortunately been confused with the U.S. dollar, and that it would not merely be the yuan, it wouldn't be an already known currency. So what do you think are the possibilities for how we could take, let's say, the initiative that not just that Marcy Kaplan is putting forward, but other people are also beginning to discuss these initiatives. Was there anything at the conference that was actually being proposed as to the forward motion coming out of the conference that would allow the participants to catalyze a kind of different discussion and maybe even legislative actions that could be taken nation by nation to address this problem of this failed monetary system?
Well, you may have more of a sense than I did. I didn't get to finally listen to the fourth panel. But one, this Glass-Steagall, as you already mentioned, being global, this bank separation idea being global. And then we have a challenge, which is, as Helga keeps saying, it's not multipolarity. We don't want different spheres. We want mankind, each within our own perfectly sovereign nation and language culture, but to come together to do things which are good for mankind. Because as long as we have the idea that we're in some sphere that has a different interest than the people in the other sphere, you have a potential for conflict. Now, I think we can reflect here why people wouldn't want to work with us or why they wouldn't trust us. I mean, you look at what happened with Nord Stream 2, for example. You look at the fact that we never got to the bottom of what happened with 9/11, but we went ahead and blew Iraq back to the Stone Ages and killed 1 million people or so. And we stole everyone's money that was in the New York-based Federal Reserve, Afghanistan, Russia, probably others. So I think we have a big challenge in the U.S. to make our nation trustworthy again, to be able to participate in dialogue with other nations which clearly have a different commitment. We also saw, going into the conference, and also I think by some of the speakers there, a new kind of confidence, maybe because the United States really has nothing to offer to the world, and you have such a powerful coalition now. There really is another game in town. There really is an alternative, and therefore people don't have to toe the line of sucking up to whatever Joe Biden or Tony Blinken or King Charles says. And I found that very refreshing to hear people from many different nations speaking with such confidence and optimism about the direction of their countries. And I think Americans haven't gotten it. It is very important that Americans realize that most of the world doesn't see us as the leader anymore.
I see that also. You've got an event that you're going to be involved with on this coming Saturday. And in addition, specifically, Scott Ritter is going to be one of the people that's going to be involved. What's he been saying recently? I think everybody on this platform should know who he is. Okay, former weapons inspector in Iraq, but he also played an important role last year when the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation put out the kill list, which you were also one of the people included, as was Helga Sepp-LaRouche, and Scott made it his business to make things particularly hot to the United States Congress on that. Now, recently, I know he's been saying various things about the Ukraine situation, essentially saying that it's it's already militarily unwinnable on the part of Ukraine, no matter what's being said by the United States. It may be unwinnable on the part of Russia in one sense, but in any case, his point is no matter how valiantly you may think people are fighting or how ruthlessly you may think the war is going, it can only end one way. And the inability of Western Europe and the United States to produce the artillery shells alone that are needed, just that one aspect, let alone all of the other infrastructure-related aspects, means that there's no possible way this conflict really works. Also, Colonel McGregor and others are noting that NATO seems to now have become much more divided about how to proceed with the war. What's your view of this, and whether you have a sense of whether Scott or others in the United States are also thinking about this whole process?
Well, since we now know from Seymour Hersh that the Ukrainian military depends on Russia for some of their fuel, it does show you that Russia could wipe Ukraine off the map at any moment if they cared to do something so cruel. They don't, because in many ways it's very much like the Civil War. You can't imagine how many families are divided fighting on opposite sides. It's just horrible, absolutely horrible. And even cold, bloodthirsty people from NATO have expressed that the kind of fighting going on in Ukraine is unimaginable to people right now. Now, what Scott Ritter has said, Colonel McGregor and others, is that the death toll among the Ukrainian troops is very, very high, maybe as high as even 300,000. I don't know that if it's true or not. I think everyone's admitting widely it's well over 120,000. The deaths among Ukrainians are between 5 to 10 times the death rate of Russians. It's a horrible situation. It is the case that the Ukrainian military are fighting very tenaciously in general as they can, but it's also the case that there's a lack of morale, there's enormous corruption, people feel they're not being given what they need, they know that there's massive theft and so on, and Zelensky is becoming more and more of a dictator. So they are also running out of troops. And that becomes a real question. If we're running out of ammunition, are we now going to send troops? Is Biden going to propose that? He's crossed a number of the lines of the things he said he wouldn't do, no heavy weaponry, no tanks, this, that. We've crossed all those lines. We know we have troops in Ukraine. I heard an interview with Robert Kennedy Jr. where he talked about his son having been in Ukraine, his son's in the military. But are we going to send more? Are thousands of Americans going to be put in harm's way for what is becoming a hot war against Russia? I think these are real questions. Ukraine clearly doesn't have the ability to do a kind of decisive offensive, and I don't know if he's saying something new, but what I heard before, Scott Ritter's view was that this thing could very well be over by the end of the summer. I don't know, because I don't know what the West is capable of doing. And I think one factor which is often misestimated by people who have, say, a military background and not the kind of background that Lyndon LaRouche had, who are not looking at the economy, the breakdown of the transatlantic system as being the reason for the desperation of the Anglosphere, the British Empire approach, that sometimes gets underestimated. So will they figure out a way to prolong this? I don't know, but I think they also want to open up a flank against China, and that is over the top beyond anything insane, because what we've done with our actions with Taiwan, provoking China, and then the papers that were leaked showing that the U.S. was spying on South Korea, which created quite a rift with South Korea. And then North Korea, which is on the brink of giving up their nuclear weapons, and now that Biden didn't pick up on what Trump had been trying to do, and the fact that North Korea was ready to give up their nuclear weapons has totally antagonized them. We have a mess in Asia. I mean, not a mess in the real world, but as far as the U.S., if they think they're going to war with China, they've deeply offended South Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. This is not something that we would win. So it's a quite amazing situation. My concern is the arrogance and foolishness out of their arrogance of the people making military policy in the U.S. And yes, since you asked, this Saturday I will be having a meeting in Manhattan. It's live in Manhattan, also on Zoom. And you can find information about it on my website, sareforsenate.com, where Scott Ritter, Tara Reid, Janice Kortkamp, who spent some time in Syria, Helga Zeppler-Rusch, of course, will be sort of opening things up. And then people from these different party formations in the U.S., Libertarian and People's Party, the Green Party was going to be represented speaking, but will not be now. So my campaign is going to be in a sense, the weapon for us to change the United States.
The conference that happened on Saturday actually concluded with a concert, which was actually sort of like a panel as well. And I'd like you to say something a bit about why that was and what the role of the concert was, as opposed to it being it wasn't really an afterthought. It was actually integrated in like the rest of the panels. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, I think classical music is really urgent right now. It's universal, and it reflects the principles of natural law and the natural ordering of the universe and man's relationship to that. And we have a situation where people are so bombarded with quote-unquote information and facts that they frankly haven't considered whether they ought to find out if something is true, and how do you know if something is true. And I think classical musical composition is a great way to address that, and it's also a great way to remind us of our identity as human beings as opposed to animals. And the conference this Saturday also will be opening with about 30 minutes of music.